Hello, my name is Emma, and in today's video, I am going to teach you how to tell a story in English. This is a very important conversation skill because a lot of the times when we see our friends or our family or coworkers, we often tell stories. You might talk about your weekend and tell a story about something funny that happened to you. Or maybe you want to talk about something funny from your past or something scary. So we often tell stories in conversation. So let me teach you how you can tell a story in English. So let's get started. There are different ways to introduce a story in conversation. So a lot of the times we actually will use an expression, and that shows the listener that we are going to tell a story. It's almost like a signal. So when you hear somebody say these things, you know, okay, a story is coming. They are about to say a story. So let's look at some of these different ways to start a story in conversation. This is an example of something my father says all the time in English. He always says, "Did I ever tell you about the time when blank happened?" So this can be many different things. Did I ever tell you about the time when I got in trouble at school? Did I ever tell you about the time when I met your mother? Did I ever tell you about the time when the storm of the century happened? Okay, so there's a lot of different ways you can introduce a story. This is a very common way. Did I ever tell you about the time when? You might also hear somebody say this, "Oh, that reminds me of when blank happened. That reminds me." We usually use this when someone is telling us something and it reminds us of a story. So they're saying something and suddenly we think of a story from our own experience. So maybe somebody is talking about maybe something from their childhood, and maybe they're talking about soccer, and I go, "Oh, that reminds me of when I was a child and I used to play soccer." And then I'll probably tell a story. So that reminds me is a common way to introduce a story. You might also hear this, let me tell you about the time when I got really scared. Let me tell you about the time when I was on a roller coaster. Let me tell you about the time when I went to China and my experiences there. So we often use let me tell you about as an introduction to a story. You might also say something to somebody like, "You'll never guess what happened." This is a great introduction to get the listener interested in what you are going to say. You'll never guess what happened. And then you tell something interesting that just happened. You'll never guess what happened. You might actually just say something like, "Oh, I have a funny story for you." This is common too. Or, "I have a story for you." So if it's funny, you might use this. If not, you might just say, "I have a story for you." So these are all common ways to start telling stories in conversation. Now let's learn a little bit more about how to tell stories in English. So the next thing I want to tell you about telling a story in English is you need to be careful about the length of a story. Telling stories is very cultural. So in some cultures, we might tell very long stories, whereas in other cultures, we might typically tell shorter stories. In English, people often have a shorter attention span, so they prefer stories to be on the shorter side, unless it's a really good story. So the reason I'm telling you this is it's important when you are telling a story to pay attention to the listener. You want to look at the listener and look at their cues. Are they yawning? Are they looking at their watch? That would be rude, but maybe they're doing that. Are they not even looking at you? By looking at what the listener is doing, That can actually help you improve your own storytelling because you don't want your stories to be too long and you don't want them to be too short. There's a good amount of time you might tell a story. So in English, again, usually we prefer shorter stories to longer stories. The next thing I wanted to tell you about telling stories in English is in conversation, we often use signal words. So what are signal words? Well, they're words that tell us where the story is going, or maybe they tell us the sequence of events. What happened first? What happened next? Then what happened? So to improve your storytelling, I recommend using signal words. Here are some examples. First, then, next, later, finally. These are just a few signal words, but they're examples. They really help with the organization of your story. One other point is I mentioned that it's important to listen or to pay attention to the listener and see how they are responding to your story. One good sign is if the listener says, "Then what happened?" Then what happened means they are interested. Okay, so while you're telling the story, the listener might say, "Then what happened?" So this is a good thing to hear from a listener. It means they are interested in what you are saying. And then what happened? Okay, now let's learn a little bit about the verb tenses we use when we tell stories in conversation. Okay, so when you tell a story in English, one of the most common tenses we use is the past tense. It's possible to use the present tense, but in general, we usually use the past tense when we tell stories. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the past tense and how we use this when we tell stories. So there are different forms of the past tense in English. Two examples are we have the simple past tense and we also have the past continuous tense. These are both popular to use when we tell stories. So I'm going to give you an example of the simple past tense. I saw a bear. So in a story, this is true. One time I saw a bear. Notice the verb I used. The verb is in the simple past tense. The verb is to see. I've changed the verb into the past tense, and now it is the verb saw. I saw a bear. So a lot of the times when we tell stories, we just use the simple past tense. Simple past tense, regular verbs in the simple past tense often have ed endings. So if that helps you to remember. So for example, you might talk about how you worked yesterday, or you visited your grandmother. So we use the simple past a lot when we tell stories. We also use the past continuous. So you might wonder, what is the past continuous? Well, whenever you see grammar with the word continuous in it or progressive, that usually means there's an ing ending somewhere. So here is an example of the past continuous. I was walking down the street when I saw a bear. So walking has our ing in it. It's a verb with ing. And we also have the be verb, was. So I was walking down the street. It was raining. It was snowing. It was, the sun was shining. These are all examples of the past continuous. So when do we use the past continuous, or how do we use it when we tell stories? Well, we use it to talk about either the background. So what was the weather like? What was happening when something happened? So we use it to talk about the background description, or we can use it to talk about an activity that is in progress at the time of your story. So just a clear example, here is what is happening. This is the activity in progress. I was walking down the street. So that is happening when I saw a bear. So this is an interruption of that activity. So we have videos on the past continuous. I recommend, if you don't know how to use this tense, to watch some of these videos. They can be very helpful. But again, when we tell stories in conversation, we often use the simple past tense or the past continuous tense. Now let's learn what else we use when we tell stories in English. So you've told your story now, and the question is, how do you end it? We like to signal to the listener that the story is finished. So what can we say to show our story is over? Well, there's a couple of things we can say. At the end of a story, we can say, "Can you believe that?" So this is a way to show my story is finished and it's a surprising story. Can you believe that? Or you might say something like, "I'll never forget it. I'll never forget it. I'll never forget what happened." You might say something like, "I can't believe that happened. I can't believe it. I can't believe that happened." So we often use these, especially if there's a surprise in the story. Now, sometimes when we tell a story, we think it's a great story. And we look at the listener and they are like this. They don't find the story funny. They don't find the story interesting. They're not really showing any emotion. So after we tell a story, if the listener looks like this, you can say, "I guess you had to be there." This means in order to like this story, you needed to experience it. I guess you had to be there. This is a very common thing people say at the end of stories when the reaction to the story is not good. So if the listener looks like this, you can say, "I guess you had to be there." Okay, so we've covered a little bit about how to tell stories in English. There is a lot more to say on this subject. One thing I recommend my students do is listen to people tell stories. The best way to improve is to actually hear models of what you want to do. So the way you can listen to native speakers tell stories is watch English talk shows. If you ever watch an English talk show, you will notice that the celebrity on the talk show always tells a story. And it's usually a funny story or an interesting story. And they're short. So I recommend you watch talk shows if you want to improve your storytelling. You can watch The Late Show, The Tonight Show, The Colbert Report. There are many different talk shows in English. You can watch them on YouTube, but I highly recommend doing this to improve your storytelling. So thank you so much for watching. You can practice what you learned today by visiting our website at www.engvid.com. There you can actually take a quiz on some of what we talked about today. I also recommend that you subscribe to my channel. I have a lot of different resources on grammar, vocabulary, listening, writing, and many other subjects of English. So I highly recommend doing that. Just don't forget to ring the bell. If you want to get new notifications, you need to ring the bell to subscribe. You can also check out my website at www.teacheremma.com, and there you can find more free resources on learning English. So thank you so much for watching, and until next time, take care.